Well, good morning everybody, and a warm welcome to those who are here for the first time. My name's Andrew Lickerman and I'm Dean of the London Business School. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and a special welcome, if I may, to one of the school's major early benefactors, David Sainsbury, and one of the most recent, Nati Kirsch. The London Business School was founded in 1964, just after the first de Gaulle rejection of Britain's application to join what was usually known then as the Common Market. It was then a UK-focused school in terms of faculty and students. As the school approaches its 50th birthday, it is a global school with 106 nationalities currently on campus and faculty from 30. That's one of the factors that makes it, by the independent estimation of others, one of the world's top 10 business schools. Indeed, our global approach gives us an edge over the sometimes more domestically parochial US business schools. The change to our approach is exemplified by Jaguar. 40 years ago, one of our first graduates, Sir John Egan, rescued Jaguar from extinction. Today, the company is owned by Tata, run by another of our graduates, Cyrus Mistry. We are not only committed to an international approach, but to the application of ideas in practice. Two reasons why we're delighted to host today's event in partnership with the CBI. And don't be fooled by the almost ivory colour of the paint outside or the towers. We are very much part of the real world. I've had the pleasure of hosting Tony Blair here as a speaker. We always enjoy having partner participation in our school events, and today is no exception. But before we hear from Mr. Blair, please welcome John Cridland, Director General of the CBI. John.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that very kind introduction. It's great to be here at the London Business School, and it's great to be doing this collaboration. Clearly, we are particularly honoured to have our main guest speaker here today. The CBI's interest in the debate on the future of Europe has been a strong one for many years, but you'll recall at the end of last year, CBI produced a major report called Our Global Future, which sets the European debate in a much wider context of how Britain earns its corn around the world as a global trading nation. And the perspective we brought to the European debate is truly a global one. It intrigued me as we were doing the research for that report that many of the small and medium-sized companies, the growing companies in the CBI's membership, saw particular value from the European Union in what it did in enabling them to get on planes to the far-flung parts of the world where the emerging middle classes of the new economies have buying power that they want to spend on British branded goods, products and services. But that won't be achieved by a small island nation trying to punch above its weight in global markets, setting global standards. It will be achieved by the soft power of the European Union in getting free trade agreements, of which we already have 30, and of which the next, probably the greatest prize, is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with the United States. That's what many of Britain's entrepreneurs want to see Europe deliver. And that was a clear sign that whilst the single market, that market of 500 million European consumers, is vital to Britain's entrepreneurs and the British economy, the outward-looking focus of Europe was also very important. So message one from the CBI on the reform agenda for being in a better running Europe is let's make the most of Europe's soft power around the world in helping sustain British jobs and British living standards. The second message from the CBI was a message about completing the single market. We often talk as if the single market is complete, but it's far from complete, particularly in the area of services, 80% of the British economy. We need urgent action from the new Commission and the new European Parliament. We need a renewed dynamism to complete this single market. Nowhere better illustrated than an area where the UK leads Europe, internet trading, in getting a proper digital single market. What is the sense of 28 national borders in an area that is virtual trade? And then third, we need Europe to concentrate on what it's good at, and I've already illustrated two examples of that, and not deal with things that it's bad at. It's good at adding value to the single market here and internationally. It's less good at regulating. It regulates in areas that should be left to sovereign states, that should be left to national parliaments, and it regulates in areas of lifestyle that I think explain why so many European citizens are perplexed by the added value of the European Union. So let's see a new European Commission and a new European Parliament that has a moratorium on any regulation which is best left to national and local. And then the fourth CBI call for the new European institutions is to deal with what for me is very much the elephant in the room. Looking forward at what the European Union needs to become, the elephant in the room is how two European Unions coexist in harmony. One, the European Union of the Eurozone, and secondly, the European Union of the member states who are full equity-owning members of the European Union of the 28, but are not, and in some cases don't want to be, members of the Eurozone. How those two European Unions coexist in harmony, supporting each other and respecting each other's differences, I think is one of the vital aspects of how the European Union moves forward. So the CBI has an ambitious agenda for European reform. Our small, medium and large companies have thought about this issue deeply. We believe we are better in a reformed European Union than outside with less influence. We don't want to waste the opportunity of these European elections. These European Parliament elections have given all European politicians a wake-up call to make sure that they connect better with the European citizen. What's good for British business is, in my judgment, good for the British citizen, because it's about jobs and it's about growth. And what's good for the British business community and the British citizen is good for European business and the European citizen. So I think the CBI has a relevant voice, and our message to politicians is the status quo won't do. Let's get on with reform that makes Europe more successful for the benefit of all. That's the message from the CBI, but you mainly came for the message from our guest speaker. I've worked with Tony Blair for many years. I was the Deputy Director General of the CBI. Most of the time he was in Downing Street. And a strange thing happened for me in the couple of weeks before he handed over the premiership. I got a letter from Tony Blair. I suspect a number of us got letters from Tony Blair, but it was a very personal letter. It said, "Dear John, I just wanted to thank you for all the things you've done to help the country over the 10 years I've been Prime Minister." I was genuinely touched by that letter. I hastened to write one back because I rather thought the Prime Minister had done an awful lot more to help the country than I'd done as Deputy Director General of the CBI. I only mention that story because for me it says a lot about the measure of the man we have on this platform. A man who did an awful lot for this country, who cares about this country, and who cares about the issue we've gathered together to talk about today. So it's a particular pleasure to me to be able to welcome the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, to the lectern.
John, thank you so much for those kind words. And yes, I did write letters to others, including yourself, but it was most sincerely meant, my letter to you, and thank you for all your service, not just the CBI, but to Britain. And Sir Andrew, thank you so much for putting the London Business School at our disposal for this event today. And you were referencing, and we were discussing a little earlier, the coincidence of the London Business School and de Gaulle and his no to Britain. I'm not sure that a speech about Britain and Europe is best started with references to the French-British relationship, but I always say to people that actually France was responsible for the most insincere answer I ever gave at a press conference in the UK, and as you can imagine, there's quite a competition for that accolade. And it was on the occasion after we won the bid to host the Olympics in Britain, and we'd beaten London had beaten Paris in order to do so. And the next day, I had to do a press conference with the assembled international media, and someone got up and said to me, "Mr. Prime Minister, is the fact that you beat the French to host the Olympics, does that make the victory any sweeter?" To which I said, "Absolutely not." So anyway, with the British-French relationship will always be an interesting one. The key to winning the battle for Britain's future within Europe is to win the battle for the future of Europe itself. To do that, we in Britain must make the debate more than about the repatriation of certain competences and rules. It has to be a debate elevated to a Europe-wide level, with Britain playing a leading role in the reform of Europe, not just a negotiation of Britain's terms of membership. It has to be about what is good for Europe as well as what is good for Britain. These election results matter. They are a wake-up call to Europe and to Britain. But our response, as in Britain, in Europe, should be to lead and not follow. Interpreting election results, especially when turnout is not high, is always a risky business. People vote in European elections for all sorts of reasons, and the results weren't uniform. The most spectacular result was actually in Italy, where a pro-reform, pro-Europe new prime minister won 40% of the vote. Chancellor Merkel won in Germany, and there was a strong vote for the SPD there also. And in some cases, the vote just tracked the domestic politics of the country. However, the victories of UKIP in the UK and the National Front in France, and the election of parties across the continent on explicitly anti-the status quo in Europe platforms, do signify something. They can't be ignored. They point to a deep anxiety, distrust, and alienation from the institutions and core philosophy of Europe. More than that, even amongst those who are in favour of Europe, there is a keen sense that this is the moment that is right for Europe to think carefully about where it goes from here, how it reconnects with the concerns of its citizens, and how it changes in order better to realise its ideals in a changing world. So when some European politicians say that despite the showing of the far right, nonetheless there is still a majority for a pro-Europe position, that is true, but it is also complacent and therefore dangerous. Even ardent supporters of Europe think there has to be change. Whatever the correct interpretation of last week's vote, it was not a vote for the status quo. The vastness of the ambition of the single currency project, with its inherent flaws of execution, the agony of the financial crisis and its aftermath, and then the link between the two in the sovereign debt crisis, the enlargement of Europe in a decade from 15 nations to 28, and then simply the scope and the scale and the speed of change in the modern era in technology, trade, and geopolitics. All of these factors have combined to create a much larger set of challenges for Europe and a hugely increased degree of uncertainty and unpredictability about meeting them. Within the Eurozone, Europe suddenly went from being merely important to determining bluntly and in plain view the future of nations' spending plans and policy. The pain of countries adjusting to change reality, making deep cuts in public spending, but without the flexibility of adjusting also the exchange rate, has been profound. And in many ways, the surprise has been that the outcry has not been greater. But even those of us outside the Eurozone have been deeply impacted by what is happening inside it, and have seen a set of European institutions at once more visible and more under siege. Add to this a feeling over a long period of time, and not confined to Britain, that Europe does too much of what it need not do and too little of what it must do, and you have the perfect confluence of dissatisfaction that seems to define Europe today. And yet, take a step back, examine Europe from the perspective of the broad sweep of history, and it is clear both what has been achieved and why Europe remains absolutely necessary for our future. A continent at war became a continent at peace. Prosperity came to nations that had scarcely known it. In time, countries under the heel of the Soviet Union emerged from it, reformed themselves, and East and West were reunited together. Today, the European Union is the largest political union and commercial market in the world. None of this happened easily. None of it happened without leadership of exceptional vision and courage. As for the future, in a world becoming dominated not only by the power of America, but of China, soon no doubt India, not to mention Russia, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and in time even the big nations of Africa, and where GDP and population will increasingly be correlated, there is no question that the rationale for Europe is stronger than ever. Together, the nations of Europe can wield genuine influence and weight. Alone, they will, over time, decline in relative importance. The 21st century world order will be dramatically different from that of the 20th century. The rationale for Europe today, therefore, is not peace, it is power. So how do we make sense of this paradox? That though the broad rationale for Europe is stronger than ever, the actual workings of the present EU are coming under sustained attack and criticism. And how do we avoid a retreat by Britain to the sidelines? We have to accept that there is presently a disjunction between the governing vision of Europe and its operating reality. And I believe this has come about for a reason to do with the origins of the Union. Because the original impetus, see for example Churchill's brilliant Zurich speech on the United States of Europe, came from the rubble of the two world wars, and World War II specifically from the aggression of a Nazi state that manifested rampant nationalism. The philosophy underpinning the European institutions was from the beginning that the route to peace in Europe lay through integrating the nations of Europe in a manner that diminished the nation state. The nation state was seen as intrinsically prone to this aggressive nationalism. So the federalist dream was of a time when European citizens would see themselves as part of a well-defined European polity, and though national identity would remain, the institutions of the nation state gradually would reduce in importance relative to those of Europe. The European institutions, of course, reflected a compromise between opponents of this dream and supporters of it, the Council, the Commission, and the Parliament. But the governing zeitgeist of Europe since its inception has tended to move with the federalist notion that integration must mean pushing more and more power into the Commission and Parliament and away from the Council. This trend has then been augmented by an entirely sensible argument that if you want a coherent European policy, you have to have the power at the centre of Europe to override the individual interests of nations, because otherwise one country can hold up the progress of all. And to be fair, the single market could not have been achieved without this. However, that reality has come into conflict with another. The people of Europe have not lost their sense that the primary politics of their country is national and not supranational. They do not particularly identify with Brussels. Any European polity is tenuous or at least limited. They do not feel close to the European Parliament. They're not ready for the submerging of their national politics in Europe. Yet they now see, especially if in the euro, that European politics is indeed wielding enormous power in the life of their country. So in the USA, people dislike Washington and feel close affinity with their state. But at the federal level, they accept the President of the United States of America as their undisputed leader, and if asked, will say proudly that they are American. In Europe, we're not in that position. For us, and by us I mean the Germans or the French as much as the British, the nation state still comes first. This is a big problem. It's been growing steadily over time, but now it's risen to its full height. It's there for all to see, and it is active in its effects. Seen in this way, the British issue with Europe is not really a British issue. It's actually a European issue. It's just that for historical reasons, and reasons perhaps to do with the healthy pugnacity of British politics, the British are the most out there. But why is there a genuine desire on the part of a large section of European opinion, including in France, or Germany, or Italy, or Poland, or Spain, for the UK to remain in the EU? It's not out of sentiment, but out of a self-interested desire to keep that counterweight to federalism alive and well in Europe, precisely because in those other countries it also chimes with a significant part of their public opinion. So this is a challenge for Europe as well as for the UK. And what is the answer? In the longer term, there will have to be quite radical reform of Europe's institutions. The balance between nation state and the EU will have to be readdressed from first principles, and institutions reformed in a fashion that will truly make them more accountable and closer to those they govern. This will mean a closer union, but that closeness may not be expressed exactly as it is today. However, this is a major task. There is no appetite right now for such an inquiry and the massive political questions that it will raise. Governments struggling with getting out of recession, still fragile and under intense political pressure, have no desire at the moment for such a root and branch debate. So I think we have to distinguish between the long term and the immediate. The immediate challenge is to do what can be done with the minimum of treaty change and the maximum change within the existing framework of European institutions and treaties. This should encompass both a new approach and a new agenda. The new approach should be for the Council to set out a clear, focused, and strong platform of change for Europe, one that connects with the concerns of the people of Europe, and one that has the possibility of transforming the view of what Europe can actively and not reactively achieve. And then the new Commission and new President should be charged in specific terms with implementing it. In other words, the Council has to reassert powerfully and plainly its responsibility to give Europe direction, to match the policy ambitions of Europe with a set of concrete proposals to realize them, and then task the Commission with carrying them out. The Parliament will, of course, debate the measures necessary and have to pass any laws relating to them. But the Council and Commission should have a method of engagement with the Parliament which does not leave individual commissioners swinging in the wind when they come under attack for implementing this agenda. Council and Commission have to be working in unison with each other in respect of that agenda. The agenda for reform should address the overarching issues where at present, without a European approach, the nation states are unable to advance their interests. Within the Eurozone, this means an even more explicit deal that in return for the continuation and deepening of profound structural reform in member states, there will be greater fiscal flexibility and monetary action to allow stronger growth and avoid deflation. The key here will be the positions of Germany on the one hand and Italy and France on the other. Now, reform is happening in these countries, and as the leaders of both countries know, that reform has to be accelerated and deepened. There isn't another way to long-term competitiveness, but they need their economies to grow. And for all debtor countries, unless there is stronger growth, we're imposing political and social strains in the debt reduction programs, which are hard to sustain. This will also have to be accompanied by resolution of the banking union framework to give genuine security against future crises. This is all easier to bring about and to sell in the public opinion of each nation if it is part of a grand bargain in which pain and gain are seen to be fairly balanced. The euro has survived when many said it wouldn't. And the European economy is receiving investment and growing, albeit slowly. But we shouldn't forget any progress has been as a result of determined decision-making either at the European level or at a national level. It didn't just happen. So the lesson is clear. Do a lot more of it. For the Union as a whole, there should be a big push on the single market, especially in the service sector, and on trade. As John rightly has said, the prospect of a transatlantic trade and investment partnership offers big opportunities for the future. All of this effort should be directed to showing how the jobs and industry of the future can be created by concerted European action. There are also good ideas in Europe around infrastructure and a European jobs programme, and the best of these should be taken and incorporated into this agenda for change. Energy policy is now of vital importance, not only for the competitiveness of Europe, but also as a result of events in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. A common energy policy with integrated energy markets would bring benefits to business, to consumers, by the way, not least UK consumers, and reduce the dependence of Europe on foreign energy. We have never really pursued it with the vigour it requires and justifies, yet the impact would be transformative, and at present, the energy policies of many European nations are frankly a mess. European defence should not be bedevilled by straw arguments about a European army. No one serious wants that. Nonetheless, there are obvious possibilities for enhanced cooperation in defence. If Europe wants to exercise power commensurate with its economic weight, it has to have the capacity to play its part both in military operations that may be necessary and in the essential role of security sector building in countries emerging from turmoil or conflict and with whom we want a close relationship. This is not just about spending, it is also about synergies. Recent experience from North Africa and then again from sub-Saharan Africa shows how such a capability could be used. There are other areas which I will simply list here for reasons of time, but they include the fight against illegal immigration and organised crime, action in respect of climate change, cooperation in the fields of science, technology, research, and higher education, and in art and culture. But in each area, Europe should focus not on the process for making decisions, but on the decisions themselves. What is it that we want Europe to do to make people better off, more secure, more confident about their future? Instead of trying to bring Europe closer to the people by an endless introspective dialogue about the institutional relationships within Europe, bring it closer by concentrating on measurable outcomes that affect the lives and living standards of people. And of course, one central part of this agenda would be the programme of subsidiarity, such as the British government and others are agitating for. Again, there are a wealth of suggestions on how such a programme would work and the content of it. The mood and timing within Europe is right, and it would answer at least one element of Europe that causes anger across the political spectrum. I want to be clear, though, what I mean about this agenda. I do not mean the normal Council conclusions put together at the last minute of a packed and routine Council meeting. I mean a proper programme, almost like a manifesto for change, that is sufficiently precise that afterwards the Commission knows exactly what it's supposed to do and has the full support of the Council in executing it. In the immediate term, this is the best that Europe can do to meet the aspirations of its citizens for a Europe more in touch, more effective, and better at addressing the challenges of their lives. Self-evidently, Britain would welcome such a change programme. It could and it should lead it. But to do so, it has to elevate its own debate beyond a debate simply about Britain and Europe and make it a debate about the future of Europe in which Britain is playing a leading role. If the present government is re-elected, there will almost certainly be a referendum on our membership of the EU, with therefore the possibility of us leaving the Union. Leave aside the wisdom of this referendum for the moment. The crucial point from the perspective of Europe's future is that we ensure that the British issue with Europe does not disable us from playing our part in the larger question. And this will require us to be careful in framing the argument for change in Europe in a way that builds alliances for the good of Europe as a whole, including the UK, not in a way that simply satisfies a narrow-gauge dispute between the UK and the rest of Europe. This is both good tactics and good strategy. Otherwise, we'll be left in a classic fight of one against the rest, daring the others to let us go. Remember, any agreement we get on Britain's terms of membership will have to be unanimous. That will mean we need some heavyweight support in fighting our corner. Anyway, that much is obvious. For the purposes of this speech, I'm making the point simply that Britain, properly positioned in the debate about Europe, has a great opportunity to lead it and solve both its own issue and promote necessary reform in Europe. Now, of course, part of winning our debate is to point out the folly of Britain leaving the European Union. Britain leaving Europe would put jobs at risk and cause a hemorrhage of investment. The economic arguments are powerful and they resonate. Anyone in the real world knows that though we would survive, we would be less economically attractive to the outside world. The UK not being in the euro has not harmed the city because it has a mass of other attractions and can in any event trade in the currency. Withdrawing from the European Union altogether would be a completely different matter. The comparisons, by the way, with Norway or Switzerland, favoured by the skeptics, are instructive. Norway today has a sovereign wealth fund of almost $1 trillion. It's unique in Europe. Switzerland has a very particular sort of economy that we could not replicate. And both have a very tough time negotiating the terms of trade with Europe, where they're often subject to the rules without the ability to influence them. These comparisons should offer us no comfort whatever. However, I think there are higher reasons of state why membership of the European Union is emphatically in the national interest of Britain. One is the geopolitical argument we share with other large nations in Europe about the change in the power structures of the 21st century. When Churchill made his Zurich speech, India was still under British rule. Churchill advocated in that speech political union between France and Germany. But in respect of Britain, he saw our future as still with the empire. Today, we, like France or Germany, face the same challenge. At present, we can still have strong bilateral relationships with the emerging powers. But in time, that may diminish. And moreover, for countries like China and India, they regard our membership of the European Union as strongly additive to the bilateral relationship. So leaving Europe would for sure be adverse in our relationship with them. But turn that negative penalty for leaving into something different. A positive opportunity for us in a Europe that does reform and makes itself stronger and more effective. Think not of what we lose by leaving, but what we gain in the future by helping Europe reform in the direction we desire. This would be important for us in Britain at virtually every level of strategic contemplation. For trade, for jobs, for living standards, for defence, for the environment, for our alliances and membership of international organisations. If Europe is stronger and more capable, and we are a leading and not a peripheral player in Europe, then as the world changes and new poles of power become fixed and clear, our ability to advance our interests is then anchored in something that in its own right has real reach and sway. The very rationale for Europe today applies to us in Britain par excellence. We are a country used to playing a role, at home with ambitions abroad, conscious that outside our boundaries are events that we must affect, lest they affect us in ways not to our liking. It is not those who argue that Britain should be in Europe who are at odds with our nation's history, but those who, under a false banner of independence, would make this country in fact dependent on global powers and their maneuvers, that we would be then powerless to influence or inhibit, who would have us exit from a principal stage of the world on the grounds that we would be better able to write our own script, when all that would in reality happen is that the stage would remain, the play would continue, the actors would act, but without our participation. This is not satisfying our national interest. It's traducing it. It isn't coincidence either that the anti-Europe parties are also anti-immigrant. They represent, within the UK as elsewhere, a strain of politics. It's one that ebbs and flows somewhat, but it's ever present, beneath or above the surface. But its defining characteristic is a belief that a nation's identity consists in a sense of belonging to a group of similar look, culture, history, and interests. And they regard a world that brings change in established patterns of these things as essentially a threat. It's not a surprise that both here and in France, they praise President Putin. His brand of socially conservative nationalism appeals to them. But not as a matter of politics, just as a matter of instinct, reflect for a moment on that belief. It's wholly contrary to the grain of the modern world. The chief characteristic of the modern world is change. Globalization is pushing us closer together. Technology and capital are mobile. The internet and social media are revolutionizing the way we live, work, and interact. The world works today through connectivity. The more connected you are, the better you can cope. It is for sure at times a world that's frightening and insecure, but it is a deception to tell people that they're better off shutting down in the face of it or stigmatizing those that are different in race, color, nation, or faith. The answer to the white working-class unemployed youth in alienated communities in Britain is not to tell them that their problems would be solved if there were fewer Polish people working in the UK. It is to provide them with the education and the skills and the connectivity that gives them the ability to face the world's challenges and overcome them. Anything else is worse than a delusion. It actually holds them back by giving them a grievance and not a chance. Britain's identity lies in its spirit. This spirit is intimately linked to our history, but it's not constrained by it. Part of what makes this country great is precisely its capacity to change, its outward-looking and adventurous character, its openness to new ideas and to new people. Over the course of our history, we've shown this spirit many times, but always we have had the ability to apply it to changing times. So after the war, when the first institutions of what is now the EU began, our leaders at that time saw no necessity for us to be there. But very soon, a new generation of leaders realized that as the world changed, so we had to be there and part of it. And finally, we joined. Since then, no British Prime Minister has ever suggested leaving it. Amongst all the reasons of state and geopolitics and economics, I think there's been a more profound sensibility at work. This is an instinct that we, the British, engage with the world and we don't retreat from it. This alliance with Europe isn't perfect. No alliance ever is. But breaking it up because we don't think we're able to reform it, this is not what made this country great, or has kept it, despite all our limitations, at the forefront of world events for centuries. So in conclusion, this is a big debate. There is none bigger. It is about the future of the European nations, their destiny and ours, and whether we follow that destiny together. For us, this should not be simply a dispute over the power of the Brussels bureaucracy, no matter how important, but about who we are as a country, what really inspires and motivates us, and our place in the grand scheme of things for the future. It should be a debate without intimidation or rancor, but it should surely be a debate that recognizes the enormity of what is at stake. This decision will define us for generations to come, so we better get it right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony. I'm sure that stimulated a lot of thoughts in the room, some really deep thinking there. We've got a bit of time for some questions. I'm going to start with a few leading members of the CBI who I know have some particular points they'd like to raise. I'm going to start with, I'll take them in threes, I think. Ian Conn at BP, Steve Varley at EY, and Jonathan Duck at Amtico. So if you just wait for the mic to come to you so that those viewing from a distance can still hear us. Ian.
Tony, Ian Conn, BP. My question's about competitiveness and confidence, which are two of the things that I think business people worry about the most. And many of the things you've talked about large economic blocks, the need for competitiveness of Europe, and if Europe's competitive, then Britain obviously would benefit from it. The problem is the track record's bad. So what business wants is to have the confidence that Europe actually can do something successfully about its competitiveness, because I think that'll change a vicious cycle about skepticism in its inability to do something, and the track record's not very good, into a positive cycle where business gets behind a reform agenda, believing in Europe. That is a huge conundrum for us. I wonder if you could tell us how you think Europe might go about doing that or helping that.
Easy question to start with. Let's take one from Steve, see if they get harder.
Morning, Steve Varley, Chairman of EY. Actually, a question about global trade. So the real power brokers today globally are China and the US, and a resurgent US. What help or maybe interference do you see either of those superpowers playing towards reform of the EU? And do they see this as an opportunity or actually a threat?
And last of the trio, Jonathan, if you just pass it over the aisle.
Jonathan Duck, so West Midlands manufacturing business. My shop floor have a sort of fairly earthy set of views on Europe. I can't use arguments on free trade to put forward Europe with them, because we compete with lots of people from the Far East who sit outside EU trading bloc, operate very satisfactorily. They also believe firmly in the nation state rather than the European state or even the world state. So how would you suggest putting forward the views on Europe cogently and simply so that people really get behind the project?
I think it's probably easier if I stand, because I'm used to answering questions standing up. Although you're slightly more polite than the audience I used to have. On the first point, I think, you see, one of the things that the single currency crisis has done is not actually create the need for structural reform in Europe, but just expose the need for it. I mean, the truth is the Italian pension system wasn't in its right shape in 2006. Greece wasn't properly run in 2004 in terms of its economic position. And so what I would say is you've got the opportunity, because within the Eurozone there is no way through and out the other side of it without deep structural reform. And a sense too, particularly with an enlarged Europe, that now is the right moment to take the steps that are necessary on reform, do things like subsidiarity, but also to focus on what Europe can do effectively to improve the living standards of people. And so, look, the single market was a huge reform that actually began as a British initiative. So it's not impossible for Europe. The track record is not unremittingly gloomy, but what is clear is that at certain key points, Europe is capable of taking decisions to change, and in quite a radical way if it sees the need to do so. My point is, right now, it's a moment where this reform should happen, and Britain should be engaged to make it happen. I think in respect of America and China, I think they will both benefit, in fact, from having an EU that's better able to pull its weight in the world. I do think this transatlantic trade and investment partnership is really important for us. I mean, there will be big American interests. We're fighting in this, by the way. But I think there is, again, if Europe really focused on making that a core priority, I think it could achieve that, and that would be of great benefit to us. And, because I spend a lot of time in China now, I think for the Chinese, they're keen on having a strong Europe. Partly as a counterweight to the US. And that may be for all sorts of reasons, some of which we'll agree with, some of which we don't agree with. But it offers Europe an opportunity. And I think to come directly to the final question, is I think you're always going to find Europe a hard sell. I mean, I found this when I was Prime Minister, so I've got 10 years of experience of making this case. Although I do think, Europe's one of these issues. Sometimes I say that the public has a more nuanced view of these issues than sometimes people think. And there are a group of issues in my humble experience where the public may have certain strong and occasionally partisan views, and they will express those views very strongly, and they will express them in opinion polls and so on. But actually, if the leaders of their country start to share those views, they get a bit anxious. In other words, they know, they know that's, so they kind of know at one level they want to complain about Europe. But I actually think if they got a leader of Britain, I mean, we don't, the Prime Minister's not in this position, but, if we suddenly say get out of Europe, I think they become worried about that, because they also have a sense of what is realistic and what is sensible. Now, I believe that if Europe, let me just explain what I mean by this idea of a European Council gripping the policy-making process in Europe, using the fact of a new commission, a new president, and saying, right, here is an agenda for change in Europe, and we are now going to drive this agenda through. I think that would connect with people differently. And I think part of the problem for Europe is that people don't see Europe as doing things that are going to make a difference to their lives. So some of the things that I was talking about there around jobs, around things like energy, are things that could actually make a difference to people's living standards. So I think it's a lot easier to make the case when such a strong reform agenda is being driven through. If it included a big platform on subsidiarity, I think that would resonate with people. But in the end, it's one of the things I found hardest about being Prime Minister. It used to irritate me always. People would say, "You got to listen to the people," and I would say, "I am listening, but unfortunately, they're saying different things." So, in the end, I'm going to have to make the decision here. So, one of the things that has to happen is that leaders have also got to lead, and sometimes you've got to stand up, people, and say, "Look, I'm sorry. I know that's what you think, but that's not what I believe is in the interest of the country, and here's where we have to go." And my view, ultimately, is that people would prefer that type of leadership to the leadership that just indulges them.
Now, given the questions are so unremittingly polite, let's take 2 or 3 from the media. But, but on Europe, please, yes.
Yeah, it's Ian Watson from BBC. You talked about drawing up a manifesto for change by the European Council. I was wondering if that was in part an application for Van Rompuy's job, and on the other big job in Europe, whether Jean-Claude Juncker shares your views about the need for reform, or whether he is, as David Cameron suggests, an 80s federalist. And if I may, just another issue of international importance, how dangerous do you think it would have been if the full texts and conversations between a British Prime Minister and an American President had been made public? And did you express any concerns to Jeremy Haywood or John Chilcot?
Okay, let's take 2 more and then we'll do it in a group of 3. Adam?
I better remember what all those are.
Well, I think they were Juncker, Chilcot, and are you going for the presidency, just as a recap?
Yeah, thanks, Adam.
But actually, my question was about Europe, and it is simply that it does appear to be institutionally bust. And while I appreciate what you're saying about no one wanting to go there, no one wanting to have a treaty change, I mean, if there isn't a significant reevaluation as part of this process you're asking for of how the Council works, how the European Parliament works, who should sit in the European Parliament and all the rest of it, isn't it just simply going to be something that the people of Europe are going to lose absolute confidence in?
Take that last one and then we'll move back to the audience.
Michael Savage from The Times. You've made the pro-immigration case here today, but there can be little doubt that worries about immigration at least fueled Euroscepticism here in Britain. Do you at least have sympathy with the idea of modifying free movement rules, linking it to an average GDP to sort of mollify some of those fears?
Right. If I may say so, those are remarkably good questions, and I don't mean to indicate an element of surprise. So, but actually, if you don't mind, in respect of Chilcot, I'll leave that for another day. In respect of the first two questions around Europe, no, I am not a candidate. Don't get my position mixed up with this. That's not going to happen. In respect of who should be the president of the Commission, my view is very much, and I think Prime Minister Renzi expressed this view yesterday also, that is, we should just look for the best person to do the job. There shouldn't be any predisposition towards one person or against one person. We should just find the best person to do the job. That's the single most important thing. It's an important job, and if you define it in the way that I'm defining it, in other words, you want someone who's capable of driving through that big agenda, then that's the type of person we should go for. Adam, I think there are really big long-term questions about Europe, but I think we've got to be honest and realistic about where European countries are today. I think if we were to suggest another big constitutional examination of the European institutions right now, I think many countries who are in the throes of emerging from financial crisis would just say, you know, we're not interested in doing that. Some of them would have to have referendums if they did that. I think right now, given the scale of the economic decisions they're taking, they wouldn't want such a referendum. However, there is an immense amount that can be done within the existing treaties, and there are changes around issues to do with subsidiarity that would make a real difference. In other words, I think it is absolutely possible to draw up a significant agenda for reform within Europe with the existing institutions, with the existing institutions developed and formed in the existing way. I do think longer term there is this big question that we will have to resolve, which is difficult, and I think does arise from the origins of the European Union. You know, it's very interesting when you rereading that Churchill speech is interesting because it's just it shows you the degree to which at that moment in time, you know, people really did fear that Europe would go back to war. Nowadays, if you fast forward to my generation and my children's generation, that's an issue that's literally unthinkable to them. But I do think people understand the fact that in a world that's going to be dominated, not just by America, but by China, India, and these large population countries, because the reason that when I gave that list of countries, all of them have populations larger than any European country, many of them populations double the size of any European country. You know, take a country like Indonesia, it's 3 times the population of Germany. Right. As GDP and population become realigned, which I think is the trend that is happening, it's the reason why the Chinese economy was the biggest economy in the world up until the sort of early 19th century. As that happens, you know, the future for Europe and for European nations is one in which, you know, we're going to have to come together in order to exercise weight and influence. Now, I think that is, most people conceive of that as the nation states coming together in cooperation. So I think there will be long-term issues around the reform of Europe that we will have to address. But right now, I think we need to do as I've described. On immigration, I mean, I'm not saying there shouldn't be adjustments or changes. And of course, you know, just to state this very clearly, when I was the Prime Minister, and we fought a 2005 election pretty much initially at any rate around the issue of immigration, the reason I put forward at the time identity cards with biometric technology, which is where I think the world will eventually get to, is precisely because I recognize there is a real concern about immigration, and the reasonable end of that concern is what are the rules? What's the order in this? If you mirror this debate here with the debate in the US, it's exactly the same. People can understand that immigration may be a good thing, but they want some rules and order around it. Now, I think you've got to distinguish between that and a desire to keep out people who are different, which I think is a regressive and reactionary view and you just have to take on. But where I think it is very, you know, dangerous and wrong for leaders in British politics is to think you're going to address the concerns of people who are worried about jobs, their future, how they get some hope and opportunity, to play into an idea that what's holding them back is someone else is coming in and taking their opportunity from them. Because it isn't true. And so it's not helpful. And actually, if you look at what is going to make this country great in the future, it is to use the connections that Britain has, you know, its language, its position in the world, its history, to make that connectivity. If we do that, we're going to be highly successful as a country. We're never going to do it by an attitude that says we don't like foreigners. So you've got to distinguish between the justifiable concerns and the desire for order and what is in the end a prejudice that is neither very pleasant nor very fruitful.
We've time for one last cluster of three. So who wants to ask? One here, yeah. One in the middle. Yep, Mike's coming to you now.
Mark Hennessy from the Irish Times. What sort of reaction do you think a British Prime Minister would get on the night he goes into a European Council meeting saying, "Hey guys, I'm here to lead"?
Okay, can we have the mic in the middle? Second row, thank you. And can I have one more hand? Yes, front row.
Phil Murphy from BG Group, but speaking in a personal capacity. Tony, you've made it clear that you're not going to seek a formal position, but it has been reported that you'll be a visible and consistent leader in this debate. A, is that true? Second question, the reform proposal that you've just outlined there doesn't sound very much like David Cameron's modest 2014 to 2017 initiative. Do you regard the Cameron initiative as a useful start, an exercise fraught with danger, or something else?
Have you just passed the mic into the front row? Thank you.
Peter Wilding from British Influence. Excuse me. Following on from the first question, how do you reconcile the fact that in a report we did in January, Britain actually wins up to 60% of its policy objectives in Europe? However, we also did a poll of the people who thought that Britain had, 75% of them said Britain had zero influence in Europe. And in fact, the general view was that Britain was a country ganged up on, had no friends, whose policies were rejected, and in fact, the French and Germans run the show anyway.
Right. You know, what reception of British Prime Minister get? Look, I used to go in and say that frequently, and you know, I found, to go to the last point that was made there, I found that by and large, most of the time we got our own way. In fact, we were talking about the Commission President earlier. Barroso was appointed Commission President when the French-German candidate was blocked by an alliance put together essentially from the UK. I think we got absolutely no problem in leading in Europe. A lot of people want us to lead in Europe. The British have, by the way, probably amongst the top 2 or 3 political systems in Europe, which is important. In other words, the quality of the people. You know, I've occasionally had my criticisms of the British civil service, but I have to say I think the people who serve us in Brussels at virtually every level do a really good job. They're of high quality. We've got these guys in the CBI and others who are as good as anyone in Europe at lobbying for British positions. I mean, we don't have a huge problem winning our corner in Europe. The problem is often that we think we can't, or the people think we can't. But then that's, for many reasons, without going into a sort of riff on the media, it's partly the way that things are often reported. But you know, we've just got to put that to one side. And to go to the point that Phil was making to me, I mean, I actually think David Cameron can perfectly easily argue a big agenda for change in Europe. I mean, on subsidiarity and so on, he's already making the case. My point is that you're in a stronger position to do that if you're building alliances in the whole of Europe that come in behind a platform that people can respond to. And my sense, and I've talked to several European leaders in the last few weeks, all of whom I think are quite anxious for the British participation. I mean, you've got to ask yourself, I mean, I did this rhetorically when I was speaking earlier, why is it that people want the British, you know, to remain in Europe? Why is, you know, when you speak to Chancellor Merkel, for example, why is she keen and enthusiastic for Britain to stay in Europe? It isn't for sentimental reasons. It's because in the debates in Europe, they know that it is sensible to have a strong voice that's going to be quite challenging on some of the European issues from time to time, and that will also be a reforming voice. And that's because for many of these countries, you know, they expect and want the British to play a strong role. And You know, I've found throughout my 10 years as Premier, even in the most difficult situations, we could always build an alliance. I mean, even when we were going through post 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, we built alliances. And, you know, we just got to have some confidence in ourselves in this argument. You know, we do have a strong political system. We've got ideas that would make Europe better. And as Europe tries to emerge from this single currency crisis, I mean, they're open to many of the things that we're talking about. Because ultimately, what is completely clear is that the single currency cannot work unless there is a structural alignment of the economies within the Eurozone. What does that mean? It means many of the types of reforms we've been arguing for. So I think we've got a great opportunity. We just got to have confidence. I think that it's completely consistent with what the British government wants to achieve. And I think that in the end, it's a, you know, I feel sometimes very much the same when we think about the Scottish referendum that's coming up soon. I mean, it's people have got to take a step back and really examine where we want to be in the modern world. And if you take a country like Britain, I mean, with this strong and rich history and tradition and past, the essence of this country is a spirit of adventure and endeavour and engagement. You take that out of what we are and you diminish us. And you know, in a world that's going to depend for countries other than the very largest on the strength of your alliances, why on earth would you want to rip up the alliance, which is the biggest political union, biggest commercial market in the world, right in your doorstep? So whatever the issues within Europe, you've got to resolve those and then get on to the big picture. Otherwise, you know, you may have an interesting debate within a short span of history, but in the broad sweep of history, you lose out. And that's essentially what this debate is about, and we should have the courage and determination and confidence to lead it.
Well, Tony, thank you for helping the CBI make the case for being a leading player in a reformed Europe. Thank you for hosting us today. I think it's been a fabulous event. I think we should leave it there and get back to the day job. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Blair.